Picture this. You're scrolling through social media when someone shares a post claiming that Jesus of Nazareth never existed at all. The comments explode into chaos. Some people are furious, others are confused, and a few seem oddly excited about the controversy. But here's the thing that should make you pause and think, what if I told you that this debate isn't actually happening where you might expect it to be happening? While millions argue online about whether Jesus was real, there's a group of people who've dedicated their entire careers to studying ancient history, archaeology, and first-century Palestine. These scholars spend decades learning ancient languages, poring over manuscripts, and excavating archaeological sites. And here's what's absolutely fascinating. They've reached a conclusion that might surprise you. But before we dive into what the experts actually think, let me ask you something. How much of what you believe about Jesus comes from Hollywood movies, internet memes, or that one professor who seemed to enjoy shocking students? Because what I'm about to show you in this video will challenge everything you think you know about one of history's most controversial figures. Today, we're tackling the ultimate question that sparked more debates, launched more books, and divided more dinner tables than perhaps any other historical inquiry. Jesus of Nazareth, man, myth, or Messiah? And I'm going to walk you through exactly what the evidence shows, but fair warning, the answer isn't what most people expect. Now, I've spent months researching this topic, diving deep into scholarly journals, archaeological reports, and ancient texts. I've read arguments from believers, skeptics, and everyone in between. What I discovered will probably surprise you, no matter which side of this debate you're currently on. But here's what makes this investigation so compelling. We're not just dealing with religious beliefs here, we're dealing with historical methodology, archaeological evidence, and scholarly consensus that crosses religious and ideological lines. So whether you're a devout Christian, a hardcore atheist, or someone who's never really thought about this question before, stick around, because by the end of this series, you'll have the tools to understand what historians actually know about Jesus, what they don't know, and why this matters more than you might think. Let's start with something that might shock you. In academic circles, there's actually very little debate about whether Jesus of Nazareth existed as a historical person. I know that sounds crazy given all the online arguments, but here's the reality. The overwhelming scholarly consensus is that Jesus was a real historical figure who lived in first-century Palestine. But wait, before you start celebrating or getting defensive, here's where it gets interesting. When historians say Jesus existed, they're not saying anything about his divine status, his miracles, or whether he rose from the dead. They're simply saying that a Jewish preacher named Jesus lived in the region of Galilee around 2,000 years ago, gathered followers, and was eventually executed by the Roman authorities. Michael Grant, a respected classicist and historian, put it this way: in recent years, no serious scholar has ventured to postulate the non-historicity of Jesus, and Richard Burridge, another prominent scholar, noted that he doesn't know any respectable critical scholar who argues that Jesus never existed. These aren't Christian apologists talking here. These are historians who study the ancient world professionally. But here's where the story gets really fascinating. Despite this scholarly consensus, there's been a growing movement online promoting what's called the Christ myth theory, the idea that Jesus never existed at all. The proponents of this theory argue that Jesus was entirely made up, a fictional character created by early Christians who borrowed elements from pagan mythology and Jewish traditions. The most prominent advocate of this position today is Richard Carrier, who's written extensively arguing that there's insufficient evidence for Jesus' existence. Carrier proposes something that sounds almost like science fiction. He suggests that Jesus was originally conceived as a celestial being who existed only in heavenly realms, where he was crucified by Satan and demons in outer space, and only later was this cosmic figure transformed into an earthly historical person by the gospel writers. Now, I know what you're thinking. That sounds pretty wild, right? And that's exactly what most historians think too. The mythicist position, while it's gained popularity on the internet, hasn't convinced the academic community. In fact, scholars have identified several major problems with these theories. First, there's the evidence problem. We actually have quite a bit of evidence for Jesus' existence, especially considering he was a peasant in a remote corner of the Roman Empire. The historical sources mentioning Jesus include not just Christian writers, but also Jewish historians like Josephus and Roman historians like Tacitus. These sources weren't Christians trying to promote their faith. They were often hostile, or at least neutral toward Christianity. Josephus, writing in the late 1st century, mentions Jesus twice in his histories. He describes him as a wise man who performed surprising deeds and gathered followers, and he specifically mentions Jesus' execution under Pontius Pilate. Now, scholars debate whether some Christian scribes later added material to Josephus' account, but most experts agree that the core references to Jesus are authentic. Then there's Tacitus, the Roman historian, who wrote about Nero's persecution of Christians after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. He explains that Christians got their name from their founder, Christus, who was executed by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. What makes this particularly valuable is that Tacitus clearly despised Christians, calling their beliefs a deadly superstition. He had no reason to invent Jesus. If anything, he would have preferred to debunk Christianity entirely. But here's something that really drives the point home about Jesus' historicity. There are certain details about Jesus that early Christians probably wouldn't have invented if they were making up a Messiah figure. For instance, Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist. This created a theological problem for early Christians, because it suggested that Jesus was somehow subordinate to John. If you're inventing a perfect divine figure, why include an embarrassing detail like that? Similarly, Jesus was crucified, which was considered the most shameful and humiliating form of execution in the Roman world. The Apostle Paul himself called the crucifixion a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. If early Christians were fabricating a Messiah, they probably would have chosen a more dignified death, not the execution method reserved for slaves and rebels. These details fall under what historians call the criterion of embarrassment, the idea that early Christians were unlikely to invent stories that made Jesus look weak, subordinate, or shameful. The fact that these embarrassing elements are preserved in multiple early sources suggests they were too well known to be omitted or changed. Now, let's talk about the archaeological evidence, because this is where things get really interesting. While we don't have physical artifacts directly connected to Jesus himself, and honestly, we wouldn't expect to, given that he was a peasant in ancient Palestine, we do have archaeological evidence that supports the general historical context described in the New Testament. For example, in 1961, archaeologists discovered the Pilate stone at Caesarea Maritima. This limestone inscription explicitly mentions Pontius Pilate and confirms his role as prefect of Judea, exactly as described in the Gospel accounts. Before this discovery, some skeptics had questioned whether Pilate even existed. The stone settled that debate definitively. Archaeologists have also uncovered evidence of 1st century Nazareth, Jesus' supposed hometown. For years, some scholars argued that Nazareth didn't exist in Jesus' time, but excavations have revealed houses, tombs, and other structures dating to the 1st century CE. The town was small and insignificant, which actually supports the Gospel accounts rather than contradicting them. Even more compelling, archaeologists have found physical evidence of Roman crucifixion practices. In 1968, they discovered the remains of a crucified man named Yehohanan, dating to the 1st century. The nail was still lodged in his heel bone, providing concrete evidence of exactly how Romans conducted crucifixions. This confirms that the crucifixion methods described in the Gospels were historically accurate. But here's where we need to be really careful about what we're claiming. All of this evidence supports the conclusion that Jesus existed as a historical figure, but it doesn't prove the supernatural claims made about him. That's a crucial distinction that often gets lost in these debates. The historical consensus is that Jesus lived, preached, gathered followers, and was executed by the Romans. Beyond that, historians diverge significantly in their conclusions about what Jesus taught, what he claimed about himself, and what actually happened during his ministry. This brings us to one of the most important distinctions in Jesus' scholarship: the difference between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. The Jesus of history is the figure that can be reconstructed using historical methods, a first-century Jewish preacher who lived in Palestine. The Christ of faith is the figure described in Christian theology, the divine Son of God, who performed miracles and rose from the dead. Historians, working within the constraints of their discipline, can only address questions about the historical Jesus. They can't use historical methods to prove or disprove claims about divinity, miracles, or resurrection, because these fall outside the realm of historical investigation. This creates an interesting paradox for both believers and skeptics. Some religious people get frustrated with historians because they won't validate supernatural claims, while some atheists get upset because historians won't dismiss Jesus entirely. But this is actually how good historical scholarship works. It follows the evidence where it leads, regardless of what anyone wants to believe. So what can historians tell us about the Jesus of history? Well, there are a few facts that enjoy what scholars call almost universal assent. Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist, and Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Beyond these two events, things get much more complicated and contentious. Most historians agree that Jesus was a Galilean Jew who lived during the 1st century CE. He probably spoke Aramaic as his primary language, though he may have known some Hebrew and possibly Greek. He grew up in or around Nazareth, a small village in Galilee that probably had a population of only a few hundred people. But here's where things start getting really interesting, and where the scholarly debates begin in earnest. What exactly did this historical Jesus teach? What did he claim about himself? How should we understand his relationship to Judaism and to the political situation in 1st century Palestine? Different historians have painted dramatically different portraits of Jesus. Some see him as an apocalyptic prophet who believed the end of the world was imminent. Others view him as a social revolutionary fighting against Roman oppression and economic inequality. Still, others portray him as a wisdom teacher, sharing philosophical insights about how to live a meaningful life. John Dominic Crossan, one of the most prominent Jesus scholars, argues that Jesus was primarily concerned with social justice and challenging the hierarchical structures of his time. In Crossan's view, Jesus' parables and teachings were designed to subvert conventional wisdom about power, wealth, and social status. On the other hand, Bart Ehrman, another highly respected scholar, contends that Jesus was fundamentally an apocalyptic preacher who believed God was about to intervene dramatically in human history. According to Ehrman, Jesus thought the current world order was about to end, and he was preparing his followers for God's imminent kingdom. Then there's the Jesus Seminar, a group of scholars who gained significant media attention in the 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds. They took a highly skeptical approach, arguing that most of the sayings attributed to Jesus in the Gospels were actually created by later Christian communities. They concluded that the historical Jesus was primarily a wisdom teacher who spoke in parables and aphorisms. But here's the thing about the Jesus Seminar that most people don't realize. Their conclusions were highly controversial even within the scholarly community. Many historians criticized their methodology and questioned whether their approach was truly objective. Critics pointed out that the seminar's members came disproportionately from liberal institutions and seemed to have predetermined conclusions about what Jesus could or couldn't have said. This raises a crucial question about historical Jesus research. How do we separate reliable historical information from later theological interpretation? The Gospels, our primary sources for Jesus' life and teachings, were written decades after his death by people who believed he was divine. Can we trust them as historical sources? This is where historians employ various criteria to try to identify authentic historical material. We've already mentioned the criterion of embarrassment, the idea that early Christians wouldn't have invented embarrassing details. There's also the criterion of multiple attestation, which gives more weight to stories or sayings that appear in multiple independent sources. Another important criterion is dissimilarity, sometimes called the criterion of double dissimilarity. This suggests that sayings or actions that are unlike both contemporary Judaism and early Christianity are more likely to be authentic, because there would be no obvious reason for later Christians to invent them. But here's the problem with these criteria. They're all somewhat subjective, and different scholars apply them differently. What one historian considers embarrassing Another might see as theologically motivated. What looks like multiple independent sources to one scholar might appear to be dependent sources to another. This subjectivity helps explain why there's so much disagreement among historians about the details of Jesus' life and teachings, even though they agree he existed. The tools we use to separate history from theology aren't as precise as we might like them to be. Let me give you a concrete example of how this plays out. The Gospel of Mark tells us that when Jesus was arrested, a young man was following him, wearing nothing but a linen cloth. They caught hold of him, but he left the linen cloth and ran off naked. This is a weird, seemingly pointless detail. Why would Mark include it? Some scholars argue this passes the criterion of embarrassment. Why would Christians invent such an odd, undignified scene? Others suggest it might be Mark's way of inserting himself into the narrative as an eyewitness. Still, others think it's a symbolic detail meant to evoke biblical imagery. The point is, even with a relatively minor detail like this, historians can reach completely different conclusions. Now, this uncertainty doesn't mean that historical Jesus research is worthless or that we can't know anything reliable about Jesus. It just means we need to be humble about the limitations of historical investigation, especially when dealing with figures from the ancient world. But there's another layer to this story that makes it even more fascinating. In recent decades, archaeologists have made discoveries that have dramatically improved our understanding of first-century Palestine. We now know much more about the social, economic, and political context in which Jesus lived. For instance, excavations in Galilee have revealed that the region was more Hellenized, influenced by Greek culture, than scholars previously realized. Towns like Sepphoris, just a few miles from Nazareth, were cosmopolitan centers with theaters, markets, and diverse populations. This suggests that Jesus probably grew up with more exposure to Greek culture and Roman politics than the Gospels explicitly indicate. Archaeological work has also shed light on the economic conditions of first-century Palestine. We can see evidence of increasing wealth inequality, with elaborate mansions being built in Jerusalem while most people lived in simple one- or two-room houses. This economic disparity helps explain why so many of Jesus' parables deal with themes of wealth, poverty, and social justice. The discovery of fishing boats, synagogues, and mikvahs, Jewish ritual baths, from Jesus' time period helps us understand the religious and cultural world he inhabited. We can see that Judaism in first-century Palestine was diverse and complex, with different groups holding different beliefs about everything from purity laws to resurrection. All of this archaeological evidence doesn't prove specific claims about Jesus, but it does help us evaluate whether the gospel accounts fit plausibly within their historical context, and generally speaking, they do. The social world described in the Gospels matches what we know about first-century Palestine from other sources. But here's where things get really complicated, and where we need to address some popular misconceptions that circulate widely on the internet. You've probably encountered claims that Jesus was based on earlier pagan gods like Mithras, Horus, or Dionysus. These arguments suggest that early Christians simply borrowed mythological elements from mystery religions and created a fictional Jesus figure. This is where we need to be extremely careful about our sources and methodology. While it's true that there were dying and rising gods in various ancient religions, the specific parallels that are often drawn between Jesus and these figures are frequently exaggerated or based on misunderstandings of the ancient sources. For example, claims about Horus being born of a virgin, having 12 disciples, and rising from the dead are not supported by actual Egyptian texts. These alleged parallels often come from 19th and early 20th century sources that were not based on careful study of ancient Egyptian religion. When modern Egyptologists examine the original texts, these parallels simply don't hold up. The same is true for most of the other alleged parallels between Jesus and pagan gods. While there are some genuine similarities, the idea of divine figures who die and return to life appears in various cultures. The specific details that would make these parallels convincing are often absent or distorted. Moreover, we need to remember that Judaism in the first century had its own rich tradition of messianic expectation and apocalyptic literature. Early Christians didn't need to borrow from pagan sources to develop their beliefs about Jesus. they had plenty of Jewish precedents for concepts like resurrection, divine intervention, and messianic figures. This doesn't mean that early Christianity developed in complete isolation from the broader cultural context of the Roman Empire. Obviously, as Christianity spread beyond its Jewish origins, it encountered and sometimes adapted elements from Greek philosophy and other intellectual traditions. But the core claims about Jesus, his existence, his teaching ministry, and his crucifixion don't require pagan influence to explain them. So where does all of this leave us? We've established that the scholarly consensus strongly supports Jesus' historical existence, but historians disagree significantly about the details of his life and teachings. We've seen that archaeological evidence supports the general historical context of the Gospel accounts, but doesn't prove specific supernatural claims. And we've noted that alleged parallels between Jesus and pagan gods are often overstated or inaccurate. But here's where the plot thickens in ways that most people never consider. We've been talking about Jesus as if he existed in a vacuum, but the reality is that first-century Palestine was a powder keg of political tension, religious ferment, and social upheaval. Understanding this context is absolutely crucial for evaluating any historical claims about Jesus. Picture this. You're living under Roman occupation in a region where different Jewish groups are constantly arguing about how to respond to foreign rule. Some want armed rebellion, others advocate accommodation. Still others retreat into religious communities waiting for divine intervention. Into this chaos steps a preacher from an insignificant village, claiming to have answers about God's kingdom. The political situation was incredibly complex. Herod Antipas ruled Galilee as a client king under Roman authority, trying to balance Jewish sensibilities with Roman expectations. The high priests in Jerusalem collaborated with Roman authorities, while simultaneously trying to maintain their religious legitimacy. Revolutionary groups like the Zealots advocated violent resistance, while Pharisees debated legal interpretations and Sadducees controlled the temple establishment. This context helps explain why Jesus' message would have been both appealing and dangerous. Any talk about God's kingdom would have been heard as potentially subversive by Roman authorities, who were already nervous about Jewish uprisings. At the same time, religious authorities would have been suspicious of anyone claiming special divine authority outside established channels. But here's what makes this historical puzzle so fascinating. The sources we have about Jesus don't fit neatly into any of the expected categories. He's not quite a revolutionary, not quite a traditional rabbi, not quite a Hellenistic philosopher, and not quite an apocalyptic prophet, even though he shares characteristics with all of these figures. Take his teaching style, for example. Jesus frequently spoke in parables, which was a recognized Jewish teaching method, but his particular use of parables was distinctive. Unlike typical rabbinic parables that illustrated points of religious law, Jesus' parables often subverted expectations and challenged conventional wisdom about God, society, and human relationships. Consider the parable of the Good Samaritan. In the first-century Jewish context, Samaritans were despised as religious and ethnic outsiders. For Jesus to make a Samaritan the hero of a story about neighborly love would have been shocking and offensive to his Jewish audience. This kind of boundary-crossing message doesn't fit comfortably into standard categories of first-century Jewish teaching. Or think about the parable of the workers in the vineyard, where laborers who work only 1 hour receive the same pay as those who work all day. This story violates basic assumptions about fairness and merit that would have been shared across different social and religious groups. It's the kind of teaching that would have puzzled and disturbed people regardless of their background. These distinctive elements in Jesus' teaching have led historians to conclude that even if the gospel writers shaped how these stories were told, they probably weren't inventing them wholesale. The teachings are too strange, too challenging to conventional wisdom, and too difficult for early Christian communities to have created them purely for theological purposes. But let's dig deeper into something that might surprise you about the sources themselves. When most people think about evidence for Jesus, they immediately think of the 4 Gospels in the New Testament. But there's actually a much earlier source that historians consider even more valuable: the letters of Paul. Paul's letters, written in the 52nd and early 62nd of the 1st century, are our earliest Christian documents. They were written only 20 to 30 years after Jesus' death by someone who knew Jesus' original disciples personally. Paul mentions meeting with Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, and other apostles who had been with Jesus during his ministry. Now here's what's interesting about Paul's letters. He doesn't tell us much about Jesus' earthly life and teachings. He focuses primarily on Jesus' death and what he believes was his resurrection. But the few details Paul does mention are historically significant because they're so early and because Paul had direct contact with eyewitnesses. Paul confirms that Jesus was born as a human being, that he was Jewish, that he had a brother named James, that he gathered disciples, that he instituted some kind of communal meal, and that he was crucified under circumstances that Paul describes as shameful. These basic biographical details appear in our earliest sources and are confirmed by later independent sources. But Paul also reveals something fascinating about how quickly the Jesus movement developed after the crucifixion. Within a few years of Jesus' death, there were already Christian communities scattered across the Eastern Mediterranean. These communities had developed distinctive practices, beliefs, and organizational structures. They were attracting converts from both Jewish and Gentile backgrounds. This rapid expansion raises important historical questions. How does a movement based on a crucified peasant from Galilee spread so quickly across the Roman Empire? What was it about the early Christian message that proved so compelling to diverse audiences? And how do we account for the willingness of early Christians to face persecution and death for their beliefs? These questions matter because they help us evaluate different theories about Christian origins. If Jesus was purely a mythical figure invented by early Christians, we need to explain how and why this particular myth proved so successful in such a short time. If Jesus was a historical figure, we need to understand what it was about his life and death that inspired such devotion among his followers. One factor that historians emphasize is the role of claimed post-mortem appearances. According to Paul, writing within about 20 years of the events, numerous people claim to have seen Jesus alive after his crucifixion. Paul lists specific individuals and groups who reported these experiences, including people he knew personally. Now, as historians, we can't evaluate the truth of these resurrection claims using historical methods. The resurrection, by definition, would be a supernatural event that falls outside the scope of historical investigation. But we can study the historical impact of resurrection beliefs on the early Christian movement. What's clear is that these claimed experiences transformed Jesus' followers from a scattered, demoralized group into confident evangelists willing to face persecution for their message. Whether you believe the resurrection actually happened or not, the belief in resurrection was clearly the catalyst that launched Christianity as a distinct religious movement. This brings us to a crucial point about historical methodology that often gets overlooked in popular debates about Jesus. Historians can study the beliefs and claims of ancient people without necessarily endorsing those beliefs as factually accurate. We can investigate what people thought happened without taking a position on whether it actually happened. For instance, we can study the historical impact of Alexander the Great's belief that he was the son of Zeus without deciding whether Zeus actually exists. We can analyze the political consequences of Augustus Caesar's claim to divine status without evaluating the theological merits of ruler worship. Similarly, we can investigate the historical significance of early Christian resurrection beliefs without resolving the question of whether Jesus actually rose from the dead. This methodological principle is important because it allows historians from different religious backgrounds to work together on common questions. A Christian historian, a Jewish historian, a Muslim historian, and an atheist historian can all agree that early Christians claimed Jesus rose from the dead, even if they disagree about whether that claim was true. But here's where things get really interesting from a historical perspective. The early Christian movement wasn't monolithic. From almost the very beginning, there were different groups with different interpretations of who Jesus was and what his message meant. Paul's letters reveal conflicts between different Christian communities about fundamental questions. Should Gentile converts be required to follow Jewish law? What did it mean for Jesus to be the Messiah? How should Christians relate to Roman political authority? These weren't abstract theological debates. they were practical questions that divided early Christian communities. The diversity of early Christianity becomes even more apparent when we look beyond the New Testament to other early Christian writings. Documents like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, and various Gnostic texts reveal alternative traditions about Jesus that developed alongside the traditions that eventually became Orthodox Christianity. Some of these alternative traditions portrayed Jesus primarily as a wisdom teacher sharing secret knowledge. Others emphasized his role as a cosmic figure who descended from heavenly realms. Still others focused on his significance as a political liberator who challenged earthly powers. This diversity raises important questions about which traditions, if any, preserve authentic historical information about Jesus. How do we decide which early Christian sources are more reliable? How do we account for the development of different and sometimes contradictory traditions about the same historical figure? These are the kinds of questions that keep historians busy, and they help explain why there's still so much scholarly debate about Jesus despite the consensus that he existed. The historical evidence is sufficient to establish that Jesus lived, but interpreting that evidence requires making judgments about source reliability, cultural context, and the development of early Christian traditions. Let me give you a concrete example of how this plays out. The Gospel of John, written probably in the 92nd of the 1st century, presents a very different picture of Jesus than the earlier Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In John, Jesus speaks in long philosophical discourses about his divine identity. In the earlier Gospels, he speaks primarily in short parables and sayings about God's kingdom. Most historians think the earlier Gospels preserve more historically reliable information about Jesus' teaching style, while John's Gospel reflects later theological development. But other scholars argue that John preserves authentic traditions that the other Gospel writers chose not to include. This kind of disagreement is typical in historical Jesus research. The complexity of these source questions helps explain why popular treatments of Jesus often oversimplify the historical issues. It's much easier to claim either that the Gospels are completely reliable or completely unreliable than to engage in the painstaking work of evaluating different sources using historical criteria. But here's something that might surprise you about how historians actually approach these questions. Rather than starting with assumptions about what Jesus could or couldn't have done, most historians try to work inductively from the available evidence. They ask what picture of Jesus emerges when we apply standard historical methods to our sources. This approach has led to some interesting conclusions that don't align neatly with either traditional Christian beliefs or popular skeptical arguments. For instance, most historians think Jesus probably saw himself as having a special role in God's plans, but they're divided about whether he claimed to be divine in the sense that later Christian theology developed. Similarly, most historians think Jesus performed actions that his contemporaries interpreted as healings and exorcisms, but they approach these accounts as social and cultural phenomena, rather than making judgments about supernatural causation. The question isn't whether Jesus actually healed people in a medical sense, but how his healing activities functioned within first-century Palestinian society. So what's the final verdict on Jesus of Nazareth? Here's what we can say with confidence. The scholarly evidence overwhelmingly supports his historical existence as a first-century Jewish preacher who was crucified by Roman authorities. The mythicist theories that circulate online simply don't hold up under academic scrutiny. But here's the crucial distinction. Confirming Jesus existed historically doesn't resolve questions about his divine status or supernatural claims. That's where history ends and faith begins. Whether you see him as man, myth, or Messiah ultimately depends on how you interpret the evidence through your own worldview. What we can all agree on is this: understanding the historical Jesus requires careful scholarship, not internet debates or Hollywood portrayals.